The autumn wind swept across the Nebraska plains in 1884, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and the promise of another harsh winter. In the bustling frontier town of Cedar Junction, where the railroad tracks cut through the heart of what had once been an endless prairie, stood a modest auction house that had become the center of commerce for settlers, traders, and those seeking their fortunes in the expanding West. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind the worn wooden podium of Brennan's auction house, 34-year-old Daniel Brennan called out bids with a voice that commanded attention across 3 counties. His tall frame and steady presence had made him the most trusted auctioneer from Omaha to the Colorado border, yet his success in business had done little to ease the profound loneliness that consumed his private hours. The mirror in his cramped quarters above the auction house reflected a face that bore no visible scars, yet carried invisible wounds that ran deeper than any blade could cut. His dark brown hair was always neatly combed, his clothes pressed and professional, but his green eyes held a weariness that spoke of too many evenings spent alone, counting profits that meant nothing without someone to share them with. Daniel had built his reputation on honesty and fair dealing in a world where both were rare commodities. Farmers brought their livestock to his auctions, knowing they would receive honest prices. Merchants trusted him to handle their goods with integrity. Yet the very qualities that made him successful in business seemed to work against him in matters of the heart. The eligible women of Cedar Junction viewed him with polite respect but little romantic interest. His dedication to work left little time for the social gatherings where courtships typically began. More troubling still was the shadow that hung over his family name, a legacy that made many families reluctant to associate with him despite his personal character. Daniel's father, Patrick Brennan, had been a cavalry officer during the Indian Wars, serving under Colonel James Morrison in campaigns against various tribes throughout the Nebraska Territory. Patrick had died when Daniel was 16, killed during a skirmish with Sioux warriors near the Platte River. The circumstances of his death had never been fully explained to Daniel, who knew only that his father had been considered a hero by some and a brutal enforcer by others. The contradictory accounts of his father's military service had followed Daniel throughout his adult life. Some respected the Brennan name for its association with frontier defense, while others whispered about Patrick's harsh methods and questionable tactics during the conflicts that had shaped the territory's early development. The uncertainty about his father's true character created a burden that Daniel carried silently, never knowing whether to feel pride or shame about his inheritance. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the Irish widow who cleaned his auction house and prepared his meals, had been urging him for years to find a wife through more unconventional means. Her practical wisdom, shaped by decades of frontier living, suggested that traditional courtship might not serve a man whose circumstances were as complicated as Daniel's had become. "A man needs a woman to make a home," she would say while dusting the shelves lined with catalogs and account books. "And there are plenty of women who need protection and stability more than they need romantic foolishness. The world's full of arrangements that work better than love matches, especially out here where survival matters more than sentiment." Eleanor's advice reflected the harsh realities of frontier life, where practical partnerships often served families better than romantic attachments that might not survive the challenges of building civilization in hostile territory. Her own marriage had been arranged by family members who understood that compatibility and shared goals mattered more than initial attraction when facing the difficulties of frontier existence. The suggestion that Daniel might need to seek a wife through commercial arrangements rather than traditional courtship wounded his pride, but his increasing isolation was becoming impossible to ignore. At 34, he was well past the age when most men had established families. His success in business provided him with the financial means to support a household, yet his social circumstances seemed to prevent him from forming the connections that might lead to marriage through Conventional means. The traveling merchant who brought goods to Daniel's auctions had mentioned arrangements that could be made through traders who specialized in connecting frontier men with women displaced by the ongoing conflicts between military forces and tribal communities. These arrangements operated in legal gray areas that made respectable society uncomfortable, but they provided solutions for men whose circumstances made traditional courtship impractical. The moral implications of such arrangements troubled Daniel's conscience, yet his loneliness was becoming a physical weight that affected his ability to concentrate on business. The auction house that had once been his refuge now felt like a prison where he counted other people's possessions while his own life remained empty of the connections that gave existence meaning beyond mere survival. The autumn of 1884 brought news that would change everything. Railroad construction had disrupted several tribal communities, creating refugees who needed immediate assistance. Military authorities were seeking quick solutions to prevent humanitarian crises that might escalate into renewed conflicts. Among the displaced were women whose traditional support systems had been destroyed by the rapid changes sweeping across the territory. Marcus Donnelly, a trader who specialized in arrangements between displaced persons and frontier settlers, arrived in Cedar Junction with proposals that caught Daniel's attention despite his moral reservations. Donnelly's business operated on the margins of respectable society, but it served practical needs that conventional institutions seemed unable to address effectively. "I've got arrangements that could solve your domestic situation," Donnelly explained during a private meeting in Daniel's quarters above the auction house. "There's a young Sioux woman displaced by the railroad construction who needs protection and stability. She's healthy, intelligent, and understands that frontier marriages are business partnerships first and romantic attachments second, if ever." The trader's description was deliberately vague, avoiding details that might complicate the transaction. He spoke of the woman as if she were livestock being offered for sale, a comparison that made Daniel uncomfortable even as he recognized the practical advantages of such an arrangement. His loneliness had reached a point where even morally questionable solutions seemed preferable to continued isolation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. $200, and she's yours," Donnelly replied with the casual directness of a man accustomed to such negotiations. "She'll keep house, cook your meals, and provide companionship without asking questions about your family history or expecting romantic declarations. It's a business arrangement that serves everyone's practical needs." The sum was substantial but within Daniel's means, representing roughly 3 months of auction house profits. More troubling than the cost was the clear implication that he would be purchasing a human being rather than entering into a mutual agreement between equals. The moral weight of such a transaction conflicted with every principle his business reputation had been built upon. Yet the alternative was continued loneliness in a world where his social circumstances seemed to prevent him from forming genuine relationships through conventional means. The woman Donnelly described would presumably benefit from protection and stability, while Daniel would gain the domestic companionship he desperately craved. If both parties understood the terms clearly, perhaps such an arrangement could serve practical needs without constituting the kind of exploitation that his conscience could not accept. "I need time to consider this," Daniel said finally, recognizing that desperation was clouding his judgment in ways that could lead to decisions he might later regret. "Don't take too long," Donnelly warned. "I've got other buyers interested. And opportunities like this don't last forever in a territory where demand exceeds supply." The pressure to make a quick decision was clearly intentional, designed to prevent Daniel from examining the arrangement too closely or seeking advice from others who might raise uncomfortable questions about its morality. Yet his loneliness had reached a point where even questionable solutions seemed preferable to the emotional isolation that was affecting every aspect of his life. Eleanor Walsh's reaction to the proposal was surprisingly supportive, though her practical Irish sensibilities viewed marriage primarily as an economic partnership rather than a romantic union. If she's willing and you're treating her with respect, there's nothing wrong with arrangements that serve both parties, she advised. Love is a luxury that frontier life doesn't always allow, but partnership and mutual support can build something solid if both people are committed to making it work. The wisdom in Eleanor's words reflected generations of Irish experience with marriages, arranged for practical rather than romantic reasons. Her own marriage had been contracted by family members who understood that compatibility and shared goals mattered more than initial attraction when facing the challenges of survival in hostile environments. Daniel's decision was influenced by more than simple loneliness. The auction house was prospering, but success in business meant little without someone to share it with. He had built a comfortable life that felt increasingly hollow as he watched other men his age establishing families and creating legacies that would outlast their individual existence. The railroad was bringing changes to Cedar Junction that would create new opportunities for those prepared to take advantage of them. The town was growing from a frontier settlement into a proper commercial center, and Daniel's auction house was positioned to benefit from the increased trade and settlement. Having a wife would provide him with the social standing necessary to participate fully in the community's development, while giving him a partner to help manage the expanding business. 3 days after Donnelly's initial offer, Daniel made his decision. The $200 in gold would purchase not just a wife, but hopefully a partner who could help him build something meaningful from the success he had already achieved. If the arrangement proved unsatisfactory for either party, it could presumably be dissolved without the complications that typically accompanied failed romantic relationships. "I'll take the arrangement," Daniel told Donnelly during their second meeting. "But I want it understood that the woman will be treated with respect and given choices about how our household operates. This is a partnership, not ownership." Donnelly's knowing smile suggested that such noble intentions were common among first-time buyers, though his experience indicated that the realities of frontier marriage typically overwhelmed idealistic notions about equality and mutual respect. "Of course, Mr. Brennan. I'm sure you'll both find the arrangement satisfactory once you've had time to adjust to your new circumstances." The trader's casual dismissal of Daniel's concerns about treating his purchased bride as an equal partner revealed attitudes that made Daniel question whether he was making a terrible mistake. Yet his loneliness had reached a point where even imperfect solutions seemed preferable to continued isolation, and he convinced himself that his personal character would ensure fair treatment, regardless of how the arrangement had been initiated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The details of when and where he would meet his purchased bride were left deliberately vague, with Donnelly promising to send word when the woman arrived in Cedar Junction. The mysterious circumstances surrounding the arrangement added to Daniel's growing anxiety about the wisdom of his decision, but his commitment to the transaction had been made and could not easily be withdrawn without losing both his money and his opportunity to escape the loneliness that was consuming his life. The waiting period gave Daniel time to prepare his living quarters for the arrival of a woman whose background and preferences remained entirely unknown to him. He purchased new furniture, curtains, and household supplies, trying to create a domestic environment that would be welcoming to someone whose previous living conditions were a complete mystery. Mrs. Walsh helped with preparations that reflected her understanding of what displaced tribal women might need to feel comfortable in white settlements. "She'd be frightened and uncertain," Eleanor warned. "You'll need patience and kindness more than romantic gestures if you want this arrangement to work for both of you." The practical wisdom in Eleanor's advice reflected her understanding that successful frontier marriages required partners who could adapt to circumstances rather than simply following predetermined romantic scripts. Daniel's purchased bride would presumably need time to adjust to her new environment, just as he would need time to learn how to be a husband to someone whose cultural background was entirely foreign to his experience. As autumn deepened into early winter, Daniel found himself checking the roads leading into Cedar Junction with increasing frequency, watching for signs of Donnelly's return with the woman who would transform his solitary existence into something resembling a family. The auction house continued to prosper, but his concentration was increasingly divided between business concerns and anxious speculation about the stranger who would soon share his home and his life. The snow was beginning to fall when Marcus Donnelly's wagon finally appeared on the horizon, approaching Cedar Junction with a cargo that would test every assumption Daniel had made about the arrangement he had entered into with such desperate hope. The December wind howled through Cedar Junction as Marcus Donnelly's wagon rolled down Main Street, its canvas covering concealing whatever cargo the trader had brought from his mysterious journey. Daniel stood at the window of his auction house, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the approaching vehicle with a mixture of anticipation and dread that had been building for weeks. Eleanor Walsh appeared at his shoulder, her weathered hands smoothing her apron as she observed the wagon's slow progress through the muddy streets. "Whatever happens next, Mr. Brennan, remember that kindness costs nothing but can purchase loyalty that gold never could," she murmured, her Irish accent thick with concern for both her employer and the unknown woman about to enter their lives. Wagon drew to a halt outside the auction house, and Donnelly climbed down with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many days on rough frontier roads. His clothes were travel-stained and his beard unkempt, but his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who had successfully completed a profitable transaction. Despite whatever obstacles he had encountered along the way, Daniel descended the stairs from his quarters with measured steps, each footfall echoing through the empty auction hall where hundreds of transactions had been conducted with handshakes and honest dealing. Today's exchange would be different, involving human lives rather than livestock or household goods, and the weight of that distinction pressed heavily on his conscience as he approached the door. The winter air bit through his coat as he stepped outside, but the cold seemed less harsh than the scrutiny in Donnelly's gaze as the trader assessed Daniel's readiness for the arrangement they had negotiated. "She's been traveling for 5 days," Donnelly announced without preamble. "Hasn't spoken much, but she understands English well enough to follow instructions. She knows what's expected in this arrangement." The clinical description made Daniel's stomach clench with discomfort, as if Donnelly were describing livestock rather than a human being who had become an integral part of Daniel's daily existence. The trader's casual attitude toward the transaction reflected years of similar dealings, but Daniel found himself hoping that his own approach would prove more humane than the businesslike efficiency that characterized Donnelly's methods. "Where is she?" Daniel asked, his voice steadier than his nerves as he scanned the wagon for signs of his purchased bride. Donnelly gestured toward the canvas-covered wagon bed with the same casual motion he might use to indicate a shipment of grain or tools wrapped up back there. "Figured it was safer to keep her covered during the journey, with folks asking questions about my cargo. People get curious about a trader traveling alone with a young woman, especially when she's obviously not from around these parts." The explanation revealed more about frontier attitudes toward cultural differences than Daniel wanted to contemplate. Donnelly's precautions suggested that transporting a Native American woman through white settlements required concealment to avoid complications that could range from unwanted attention to outright hostility from communities still raw from recent conflicts. Daniel approached the wagon with careful steps, uncertain of proper protocol for meeting a woman who had been purchased rather than courted through conventional means. The canvas covering rustled slightly in the wind, but no sound emerged from beneath to indicate the presence of a living person. For a moment, Daniel wondered if Donnelly's cargo might be something other than what had been promised. "Ma'am?" Daniel called softly, addressing the concealed figure with more courtesy than Donnelly's manner had suggested would be necessary. "I'm Daniel Brennan. I know this situation is unusual, but I want you to know that you're safe here and will be treated with respect." The canvas stirred, and slowly a blanket-wrapped figure emerged from the wagon bed with movements that spoke of stiffness from long travel and uncertainty about her new circumstances. The heavy wool covering concealed everything except dark eyes that studied Daniel with an intensity that made him acutely aware of being evaluated in ways that his business dealings had never prepared him for. Those eyes held intelligence and wariness in equal measure, suggesting that the woman beneath the blanket was fully aware of her situation and its implications. There was no resignation or gratitude in her gaze, but rather a careful assessment that indicated she was forming her own opinions about the man who had purchased her services as a wife. Donnelly's impatience was evident in his shifting stance and frequent glances toward the darkening sky. "The price we agreed on," he said briskly, extending his hand in expectation of payment that would complete their transaction and allow him to depart before weather conditions made travel more dangerous. Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew the leather pouch containing $200 in gold coins, the weight of which represented months of careful saving and successful auctions. The money felt heavier than its actual mass as he handed it to Donnelly, recognizing that the exchange transformed him from a lonely bachelor into a husband through the most unconventional means possible. "There's one more thing," Donnelly said as he counted the coins with practiced efficiency. "She goes by the name Star, though I suspect that's not what she was called before recent events changed her circumstances. Names don't matter much in arrangements like this, but you'll need something to call her." The casual dismissal of the woman's true identity struck Daniel as particularly callous, reducing her to a commodity whose past was irrelevant to her future utility. He found himself hoping that she would eventually trust him enough to share her real name, along with whatever story had led to her presence in Donnelly's wagon rather than among her own people. "Star," Daniel repeated, testing the unfamiliar name while studying the blanket-wrapped figure who would now share his home and his life. "Is there anything else I should know about her situation or her background?" Donnelly shook his head with the finality of a man eager to conclude his business and depart. "Nothing that affects the arrangement. She's healthy, she understands her role, and she won't cause you any trouble if you treat her fairly. Beyond that, what happened before today doesn't matter for what happens next." The trader's assertion that the past was irrelevant to their future struck Daniel as both naive and potentially dangerous. Understanding someone's background seemed essential to building any kind of successful partnership, even one that had begun through commercial transaction rather than mutual courtship. However, Donnelly was clearly unwilling to provide information that might complicate the arrangement he had negotiated. With the money safely secured in his coat, Donnelly climbed back onto his wagon with obvious relief at having completed another successful transaction. "Treat her well, Brennan," he called as he gathered the reins. "Word gets around about how these arrangements work out, and my business depends on satisfied customers." The warning was delivered as advice, but Daniel recognized the underlying threat implicit in Donnelly's words. The trader's reputation and future profits depended on maintaining the fiction that his arrangements benefited all parties involved. Any suggestion that purchased wives were mistreated or exploited could damage his business relationships and potentially attract unwanted attention from authorities, who might question the legality of human trafficking operations. As Donnelly's wagon disappeared into the gathering darkness, Daniel found himself alone with the blanket-wrapped woman, who represented both the solution to his loneliness and the beginning of complications he had never anticipated. The auction house, which had always been his refuge from social uncertainty, now felt inadequate for the domestic responsibilities he was about to assume. "Would you like to come inside where it's warm?" Daniel offered, gesturing toward the auction house entrance while maintaining careful distance from the woman, who still remained completely concealed beneath her protective covering. Star nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that suggested agreement without enthusiasm. Her continued silence was beginning to concern Daniel, who had hoped that arriving at her destination might encourage her to speak or at least reveal her face. Instead, she seemed to retreat further into the anonymity of her heavy wrappings. Eleanor. Walsh was waiting inside the auction house, her maternal instincts clearly activated by the sight of a young woman who needed guidance in navigating unfamiliar circumstances. The Irish housekeeper approached with the kind of gentle firmness that had served her well in managing difficult situations throughout her years of frontier living. "Come along, dear," Eleanor said softly, addressing Star with the same tone she might use for a frightened child. "We've prepared a room for you upstairs, and there's hot soup waiting whenever you're ready to eat something." The practical kindness in Eleanor's voice seemed to reach Star in ways that Daniel's more formal courtesy had not. The blanket-wrapped figure turned toward the older woman with what might have been interest or gratitude, though her face remained hidden beneath the concealing wool. Daniel watched the interaction between the two women with growing awareness that his role in this domestic arrangement was less central than he had anticipated. Eleanor's maternal approach was clearly more effective than his awkward attempts at courtesy, suggesting that Star's successful integration into their household would depend more on female guidance than masculine authority. The trek up the narrow stairs to the living quarters above the auction house was conducted in silence, with Eleanor leading the way and Star following while Daniel brought up the rear. The domestic procession felt both ordinary and extraordinary, marking the transformation of his bachelor quarters into something resembling a family home, despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. Eleanor had prepared the spare room with careful attention to details that might comfort a woman displaced from familiar surroundings. New curtains softened the harsh angles of rough lumber walls, while additional blankets and pillows promised warmth during the cold Nebraska winter. A wash basin and mirror had been positioned near the single window, and clean clothes were laid out on the bed in sizes that Eleanor had estimated based on Donnelly's vague descriptions. "This is your room," Daniel explained as they reached the prepared space. "You can arrange things however you like, and if you need anything else, just let Mrs. Walsh or myself know." Star entered the room with cautious steps, her dark eyes visible above the blanket as she surveyed the accommodations that had been prepared for her comfort. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed to relax slightly, perhaps recognizing that her new circumstances included genuine efforts to ensure her well-being rather than simple utilitarian arrangements. Eleanor gestured toward the clothes laid out on the bed. "I've guessed at sizes, but we can get better fits once you've had time to settle in. There's a warm dress for everyday wear and a nicer one for church or social occasions, though I expect you'll want to rest for a day or two before worrying about such things." The mention of church and social occasions highlighted questions about Star's integration into Cedar Junction's community life that Daniel had not fully considered during his negotiations with Donnelly. A Native American woman married to a white auctioneer would certainly generate discussion and possibly opposition from families who had strong opinions about cultural mixing and appropriate social boundaries. Star's response to Eleanor's kindness was a slight nod that suggested appreciation without revealing whether she understood all the implications of her new situation. Her continued silence was beginning to seem less like shyness and more like deliberate caution, as if she was withholding judgment about her new circumstances until she better understood the true nature of the arrangement she had entered into. "Leave you to get settled," Daniel said, recognizing that Star might feel more comfortable with Eleanor's feminine guidance than his masculine presence during her initial adjustment period. "Mrs. Walsh can show you where everything is, and we'll talk more when you're ready." The dismissal was intended as courtesy, but Daniel found himself reluctant to leave the room where his purchased bride was beginning to establish her place in his previously solitary existence. The domestic scene felt both natural and surreal, marking the beginning of a partnership that had been negotiated through commercial transaction rather than mutual affection. Eleanor's practical wisdom was evident in her gentle but firm guidance as she helped Star begin the process of transforming from mysterious cargo into household member. "Take your time, dear," the older woman advised. "Change is never easy, but sometimes it leads to better things than what came before." As Daniel retreated to his own room to contemplate the magnitude of the changes occurring in his formerly predictable life, he could hear the soft murmur of feminine voices as Eleanor continued her efforts to make Star feel welcome. The sounds of domestic cooperation were both comforting and strange, marking the beginning of a household dynamic that would require adjustment from everyone involved. The evening meal was served in the kitchen, where the warmth from the cook stove created an atmosphere of forced intimacy among three people who were still strangers. Despite their new living arrangements, Star had finally removed her concealing blanket, revealing traditional clothing that was beautifully crafted, but entirely foreign to the domestic setting Daniel had tried to create. What struck him most powerfully was not her exotic appearance, but the bearing she carried herself with. This was not a woman broken by circumstances or grateful for rescue. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity that suggested she was evaluating her new situation rather than simply submitting to it. Her movements were graceful and deliberate, and her attention to the details of her surroundings indicated intelligence and careful observation that challenged every assumption Daniel had made about displaced tribal women seeking protection through marriage arrangements. Eleanor had prepared a hearty stew with fresh bread, food that was substantial and warming, but simple enough to avoid potential conflicts with unfamiliar culinary traditions. The meal was designed to demonstrate the household's prosperity, while avoiding anything that might be offensive to someone from a different cultural background. Throughout the meal, Daniel found himself stealing glances at Star, trying to read her reactions to her new environment. She ate carefully and appreciatively, but made no comment about the food or the domestic arrangements. Her silence was beginning to feel less like reservation and more like deliberate withholding of judgment, as if she was assessing the true nature of her situation before committing to any particular response. When Eleanor finally excused herself to attend to kitchen duties, Daniel and Star were left alone for the first time since Donnelly's departure. The silence between them was filled with unasked questions and unspoken concerns about how two such different people might learn to share a life together under circumstances that neither had chosen freely. "I know this arrangement is unusual," Daniel finally said, his voice carefully gentle as he attempted to bridge the cultural and linguistic barriers that separated them. "I want you to know that you're safe here, and I'll do everything possible to make you comfortable while you adjust to your new circumstances." Star studied his face with that same careful attention he had noticed since her arrival, her gaze lingering on his features without showing either approval or disapproval. When she finally spoke, her English was clear and unaccented, revealing that she understood far more than her silence had suggested. "You are not what Marcus Donnelly described," she said quietly, her voice carrying the quality that made Daniel's breath catch. "He spoke of a desperate man willing to pay well for any woman who would have him. You are not desperate. You are lonely." The observation was so accurate and unexpected that Daniel felt his carefully prepared responses dissolve entirely. Instead of the grateful submission he had been led to expect, he found himself facing a woman who clearly understood the complicated motivations that had brought them together and was unafraid to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about their situation. "Yes," Daniel admitted, recognizing that honesty might serve him better than the careful explanations he had rehearsed. "I am lonely. The auction house is successful, but success in business means little without someone to share it with. This town... my circumstances. They make conventional courtship difficult." Star nodded as if his admission confirmed something she had already suspected. And you believe that purchasing a wife will solve this loneliness without requiring you to risk the rejection that conventional courtship might bring. The statement was delivered without judgment, but it forced Daniel to confront the fundamental assumptions underlying his decision to enter into this arrangement. He had indeed hoped to avoid the emotional vulnerability that came with traditional romantic pursuit, believing that a commercial transaction might provide companionship he craved without the possibility of personal rejection based on his family's controversial history. The next morning brought a blizzard that transformed Cedar Junction into a world of swirling white, trapping the residents indoors and creating an enforced intimacy that Daniel had not anticipated when he planned his unconventional marriage arrangement. Through the frost-covered windows of his quarters above the auction house, he could see nothing but the endless dance of snowflakes that had begun before dawn and showed no signs of abating. Star had emerged from her room dressed in one of the simple dresses Eleanor had provided, the dark blue fabric complementing her complexion while helping her blend into the domestic setting Daniel had attempted to create. Yet something in her bearing suggested that wearing white women's clothing was a deliberate choice rather than natural comfort, as if she was consciously adapting to expectations while maintaining her own sense of identity beneath the surface. Eleanor bustled about the kitchen with the efficient energy of someone accustomed to managing households during Nebraska winters, her movements creating a rhythm of domestic activity that filled the silence between the three people who were still learning how to share living space. The aroma of fresh coffee and bacon provided a comforting backdrop to the awkwardness that permeated their interactions, despite everyone's efforts to behave naturally. "Storm's going to last at least 2 days," Eleanor announced as she served breakfast at the small table Daniel had purchased specifically for family meals he had never expected to share. "No one will be traveling in this weather, which means we'll have time to get properly acquainted without interruptions from the outside world." The observation carried implications that made Daniel both hopeful and nervous about the enforced isolation ahead. 2 days trapped together would certainly accelerate the process of adjustment that might otherwise take weeks to accomplish. But it would also test everyone's patience and compatibility under circumstances that offered no escape from personality conflicts or cultural misunderstandings. Star accepted her plate with a quiet "thank you" that revealed her efforts to master the social conventions expected in her new environment. Her table manners were impeccable, suggesting previous exposure to formal dining customs that contradicted assumptions about her background as a displaced tribal woman seeking protection through marriage arrangements. "Have you lived in white settlements before?" Daniel asked carefully, recognizing that questions about her past might be unwelcome but genuinely curious about the experiences that had shaped her obvious familiarity with European customs. Star's hesitation before answering suggested that the truth was more complicated than simple yes or no responses could convey. "I attended a missionary school for several years," she said finally. "The teachers believed that learning white ways would help our people negotiate better relationships with government authorities and frontier settlers." The revelation provided context for her sophisticated English and her understanding of domestic conventions, but it also raised questions about why someone with such education would end up in Donnelly's wagon rather than using her skills to secure more conventional employment or marriage opportunities. The missionary schools were known for producing Native Americans who could serve as cultural bridges, making Star's current circumstances seem particularly mysterious. Eleanor's eyebrows rose with obvious interest at this disclosure. "Which school?" "Dear, I've heard good things about some of the missionary programs, though others seem to do more harm than good with their rigid approaches to cultural change." "Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania," Star replied, naming an institution that Daniel recognized as one of the most prestigious and controversial facilities for Native American education. "I spent 4 years there before circumstances required my return to tribal territory." The mention of Carlisle explained much about Starr's sophisticated demeanor and her obvious comfort with white customs. The school was famous for its strict assimilation policies and its success in producing Native Americans who could function effectively in both cultural environments. However, it was also notorious for the psychological pressure it placed on students to abandon their tribal identities in favor of complete integration into white society. Daniel found himself reconsidering everything he thought he understood about the woman Donnelly had delivered to his door. A Carlisle graduate would have had numerous opportunities for employment or marriage that would have been far more advantageous than accepting whatever arrangement had brought her to his auction house. Her presence in such circumstances suggested either extraordinary misfortune or deliberate choice to conceal her true situation. Carlisle graduates usually find good positions, Eleanor observed with the kind of diplomatic understatement that avoided direct questions about sensitive topics. The school has quite a reputation for preparing students for success in business and professional settings. Starr's smile carried a mixture of pride and irony that suggested complex feelings about her educational experience. The school taught us to be successful in white society, but it could not teach white society to accept us as equals. There are limits to how much education can overcome when people prefer familiar prejudices to uncomfortable truths about individual merit. The bitter wisdom in her words revealed experiences with discrimination that had clearly shaped her worldview and possibly influenced her current circumstances. Despite her obvious qualifications and sophisticated education, she had apparently encountered barriers that had led to her present situation as a purchased bride rather than an independent professional woman. Daniel felt a surge of anger at the waste of talent and potential represented by Starr's current circumstances, followed immediately by guilt about his own role in perpetuating the system that had reduced an educated, capable woman to a commodity that could be bought and sold like livestock. His transaction with Donnelly had been motivated by loneliness rather than malice, but the effect was the same regardless of his intentions. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the inadequacy of the words evident in their failure to address the systemic injustices that had shaped both their lives. "You deserve better than being sold to a stranger, regardless of how that stranger might treat you." Starr studied his face with that same careful attention he was beginning to recognize as her habitual approach to assessing new information. "You are the first white man to acknowledge that distinction," she said with a slight smile that transformed her entire expression. "Most prefer to believe that good intentions justify questionable methods." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside that penetrated even the thick walls of the auction house. Through the swirling snow, Daniel could make out the shapes of several riders approaching the building despite the dangerous weather conditions. Their presence in such a storm suggested either emergency circumstances or determination that would not be deterred by natural obstacles. Eleanor moved to the window with obvious concern about visitors who would risk travel in blizzard conditions. "Looks like 4 or 5 men," she reported. "Can't make out who they are through this snow, but they're armed and riding military-style formation." Starr's entire demeanor changed at the mention of armed riders in military formation. The careful reserve that had characterized her behavior since her arrival was replaced by something that looked remarkably like apprehension, though whether she feared the approaching visitors or welcomed their arrival remained unclear. "Do you recognize them?" Daniel asked, noting the tension that had suddenly filled Starr's posture. "Perhaps," she replied with the kind of evasive honesty that raised more questions than it answered. "There are people who might be looking for me, though I had hoped that Donnelly's precautions would prevent them from tracking my movements so quickly." The revelation that Starr was possibly being pursued by unknown parties added a new dimension of complexity to their situation. Daniel found himself wondering what circumstances could motivate people to track a single woman through dangerous winter weather, and whether his auction house was about to become the site of a confrontation he was unprepared to handle. The riders drew closer, their military precision evident even through the obscuring snow. These were not casual travelers seeking shelter from the storm, but men with specific purpose who had risked considerable danger to reach Cedar Junction during some of the worst weather Nebraska had experienced all winter. Eleanor's practical instincts were evident in her immediate assessment of potential security concerns. "Mr. Brennan, you might want to have your rifle handy," she advised. "Men who travel in this weather usually have serious business that might not be entirely peaceful." Daniel retrieved his Winchester from its position beside the door, the familiar weight of the weapon providing reassurance, even though he hoped the approaching visitors had come for conversation rather than confrontation. His years of frontier living had taught him the importance of being prepared for trouble while hoping for peaceful solutions to unexpected problems. Star moved to stand beside him at the window, her presence creating an unexpected sense of partnership. Despite the commercial nature of their relationship, "If they are who I think they are," she said quietly, "they have come for me, not for you." But their methods of retrieval might not distinguish between willing and unwilling participants in this situation. The ominous warning suggested that Star's background involved conflicts that could endanger anyone associated with her, regardless of their role in her current circumstances. Daniel found himself facing the possibility that his simple desire for companionship had entangled him in political or military complications far beyond anything he had imagined when he first contacted Donnelly about acquiring a bride. The lead writer called out in a voice that carried clearly across the wind-whipped snow. His words delivered in English, but with an accent that suggested military training rather than frontier casualness. "Daniel Brennan, we know you have the woman. Send her out, and there will be no trouble for anyone." The formal demand confirmed Star's prediction about the purpose of their visit while raising questions about how armed strangers had learned about his recent transaction with Donnelly. The speed with which they had tracked Star to his auction house suggested either exceptional investigative skills or inside information about Donnelly's operations that had compromised the secrecy the trader had promised. Star's hand touched Daniel's arm with surprising familiarity, her fingers conveying both warning and apology for the danger her presence had brought to his previously peaceful existence. "These men work for my father," she said quietly. "They have orders to bring me home, regardless of any arrangements I might have made or any preferences I might express about my own future." The revelation that Star's father had sent armed men to retrieve her suggested family connections that went far beyond the displaced tribal woman seeking protection that Donnelly had described. Fathers with the resources to dispatch military-style search parties were not ordinary refugees struggling with displacement and poverty. "Who is your father?" Daniel asked, though he suspected the answer would not be reassuring. Star's hesitation before responding seemed to stretch for minutes rather than seconds, as if she was weighing the wisdom of revealing truths that could fundamentally change their relationship. "My father is Colonel James Morrison," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that had shaped every interaction since her arrival. The name hit Daniel like a physical blow, freezing his blood and making his grip tighten involuntarily on the rifle stock. Colonel James Morrison was the military officer who had commanded Daniel's father during the Indian Wars, the man whose orders had resulted in Patrick Brennan's death during the controversial engagement near the Platte River. Colonel Morrison was also known throughout the territory as a hardliner who believed that military force was the only effective method for dealing with tribal resistance to government policies. His reputation for harsh tactics and questionable ethics had made him a hero to some frontier settlers and a villain to others, who questioned the morality of his approach to conflict resolution. The irony was staggering. Daniel had purchased a bride to ease his loneliness, only to discover that she was the daughter of the man responsible for his father's death and his family's complicated legacy. The woman he had hoped would help him escape the shadows of his past had instead brought those shadows directly into his home. Star's eyes reflected understanding of the shock her revelation had created. "I see you know the name," she said quietly, "and I suspect you do not associate it with pleasant memories." "Your father's orders killed my father," Daniel said, his voice hollow with the weight of old grief and new understanding. "Patrick Brennan died following Colonel Morrison's commands during a raid that military investigators later questioned for its necessity and its methods." The confession created a moment of silence that seemed to stretch across decades of unresolved conflict between their families. Star's expression showed neither surprise nor denial, suggesting that she had known about the connection between their fathers before revealing her true identity. "I know about your father's death," she said with quiet dignity. "It was one of many tragedies that resulted from my father's inflexible approach to frontier conflicts. I am sorry for your loss, but I am not responsible for decisions that were made before either of us had any voice in such matters." The philosophical challenge in her words forced Daniel to confront questions about inherited guilt and individual responsibility that he had never fully resolved. Star's presence in his home was clearly not accidental, but whether she represented an opportunity for healing old wounds or a catalyst for renewed conflict remained to be determined. The riders outside were growing impatient, their repeated calls creating pressure for immediate decisions about how to respond to their demands. Star's father had apparently sent enough men to overwhelm any resistance Daniel might offer, making confrontation seem both futile and dangerous for everyone involved. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked, recognizing that Star understood the dynamics of this situation far better than he did. Star's answer revealed the complexity of her own feelings about family loyalty versus personal autonomy. "What I want and what is practical may be very different things," she admitted. "My father does not accept the refusal of his directives, especially from women he considers to be under his authority." The explanation highlighted fundamental conflicts about women's rights and family authority that had shaped Star's educational experience and her current circumstances. Her Carlisle education had apparently taught her to value independence and self-determination, while her family background emphasized traditional obedience to paternal authority. Eleanor's practical wisdom was evident in her assessment of their limited options. "If those men are military, they'll have authorization that supersedes local civilian authority," she warned. "Sheriff's not going to risk confrontation with federal officers over a domestic dispute, especially not in this weather." The harsh realities of frontier law enforcement meant that Daniel's rights as Star's legal husband would carry little weight against military authority exercised by her father. Colonel Morrison's reputation and official position would give his men advantages that civilian resistance could not overcome without risking criminal charges or worse consequences. Star moved toward the door with the kind of resigned determination that suggested she had experienced similar confrontations before. "I should go with them," she said quietly. "There is no point in creating conflict that will only result in unnecessary harm to people who have shown me kindness." The selfless decision to protect others at her own expense revealed character qualities that made Daniel's response automatic rather than calculated. "No," he said firmly, moving to block her path to the door. "You said to yourself that you have the right to make your own choices. If you want to leave, that's your decision. But I won't let you be taken against your will by anyone, regardless of their authority or their relationship to you." The declaration surprised everyone present, including Daniel himself. His commitment to protecting Star, despite the personal danger involved, represented a fundamental shift from viewing her as a purchased commodity to recognizing her as a person whose autonomy deserved protection regardless of the consequences for himself. The pounding on the auction house door began immediately after Daniel's declaration. Heavy blows that reverberated through the building, with the authority of men accustomed to having their demands met without delay. The sound carried an urgency that suggested Colonel Morrison's representatives were prepared to escalate their methods if diplomatic approaches proved insufficient for securing Starr's immediate compliance. Starr's face showed a mixture of gratitude and concern at Daniel's willingness to protect her despite the personal danger involved. "You don't understand what you're offering to face," she warned, her voice carrying the weight of experience with her father's methods. "These men have orders that supersede local law, and my father does not tolerate defiance from anyone, especially civilians who interfere with family matters he considers to be military business." Daniel checked his rifle's ammunition while considering the magnitude of the commitment he had just made. Protecting Starr against Colonel Morrison's authority would require him to defy federal military power, using nothing more than civilian resistance and moral conviction. The odds were overwhelming, but the alternative was allowing an educated, independent woman to be dragged away against her will by men who viewed her as property rather than a person with rights. Eleanor positioned herself strategically near the kitchen, where additional weapons were stored alongside supplies that could sustain them during a prolonged siege, if circumstances required such measures. Her Irish heritage had taught her valuable lessons about resisting authority figures who confused legal power with moral right, and her frontier experience had shown her that sometimes principles required practical defense, regardless of the personal cost involved. "Mr. Brennan." The voice outside carried the crisp authority of military command. "We have federal authorization to retrieve Colonel Morrison's daughter. Open this door immediately, or we will consider your resistance to be obstruction of official military business." The formal language revealed that Starr's father had indeed provided his men with legal documentation that would justify their actions if civilian authorities questioned their methods. However, Daniel's own understanding of territorial law suggested that such authorization would not automatically override his rights as Starr's legal husband. Assuming their commercial arrangement could be considered a legitimate marriage under Nebraska statutes, Starr moved closer to Daniel, her presence providing unexpected comfort despite the danger she had brought to his previously peaceful existence. "There may be a way to resolve this without violence," she said quietly. "Military regulations require specific procedures for retrieving family members who have entered into legal marriages, even marriages that were arranged through unconventional means." The suggestion that their commercial transaction might have legal standing surprised Daniel, who had assumed that purchasing a bride would create a relationship with questionable validity under formal marriage laws. If Starr's assessment was correct, their arrangement might provide legal protection that could force her father's representatives to pursue official channels rather than simple military authority. "What kind of procedures?" Daniel asked, recognizing that Starr's Carlisle education and family background had apparently provided her with sophisticated understanding of legal complexities that could affect their situation. Military personnel cannot simply claim family members who have entered into legal marriages without demonstrating that such marriages are invalid or that the family member is being held against their will. Starr explained, "My father's men would need to provide evidence that our marriage was fraudulent or that I am seeking rescue from circumstances I did not choose freely." The legal technicalities offered a potential avenue for resistance that could force Colonel Morrison's representatives to justify their actions rather than simply asserting authority through superior firepower. However, such protection would depend on local officials being willing to enforce territorial marriage laws against federal military pressure, which seemed unlikely given the political realities of frontier governance. Eleanor's practical wisdom was evident in her immediate grasp of the strategic implications. "We'll need witnesses who can testify that the marriage was legal and that Starr is here by choice," she observed. "Sheriff Thompson is fair-minded, but he won't risk his career over a domestic dispute unless he's certain he's on solid legal ground." The mention of Sheriff Thompson provided Daniel with hope that local law enforcement might indeed support civilian rights. against military overreach if presented with proper legal justification. Thompson had earned respect throughout Cedar Junction for his commitment to equal justice and his willingness to stand up to powerful interests when principles were at stake. The pounding on the door intensified, accompanied by sounds that suggested Colonel Morrison's men were preparing to force entry if their demands continued to be ignored. The building's solid construction would delay but not prevent determined men with military equipment from gaining access to the living quarters where Starr and Daniel were attempting to develop their defensive strategy. "We need to buy time while Sheriff Thompson can be summoned," Daniel decided. "Can you convince your father's men that our marriage is legal and that you're here voluntarily?" Starr's expression showed uncertainty about her ability to influence men who were following orders that probably included specific instructions about overcoming resistance to their mission. "I can try," she said, "but these soldiers know my history with family conflicts over independence and education. They may not believe that I would choose marriage to a stranger over returning to my father's authority." The revelation that Starr had previous conflicts with her father over independence issues provided context for Colonel Morrison's determination to retrieve his daughter personally rather than simply accepting her decision to marry a frontier auctioneer. Her pattern of defying family expectations had apparently created a situation where her father viewed her autonomy as a military problem, requiring tactical solution. Daniel approached the door with his rifle ready but not immediately threatening, hoping to establish dialogue rather than provoke confrontation that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. "This is Daniel Brennan," he called through the heavy wooden barrier. "Starr is my wife under Nebraska territorial law. She's here voluntarily, and any attempt to remove her against her will would constitute kidnapping under civilian jurisdiction." The response was immediate and uncompromising. "Mr. Brennan, you have been deceived about the woman's identity and circumstances. She is Colonel Morrison's daughter, a federal dependent who lacks legal authority to enter into marriage contracts without paternal consent. Your arrangement with the traitor who delivered her was fraudulent from the beginning." The accusation struck at the heart of Daniel's legal position by challenging the validity of his transaction with Donnelly. If Starr had been misrepresented as an independent woman when she was actually a federal dependent under her father's authority, then their marriage arrangement might indeed be invalid regardless of both parties' current preferences about their relationship. Starr's voice carried clearly through the door as she addressed her father's representatives directly. "Sergeant Mitchell, I recognize your voice. You know that my education at Carlisle was specifically designed to prepare me for independent decision-making about my future. I am not a child requiring paternal consent for marriage, and I choose to remain here with my husband." The mention of Sergeant Mitchell provided both parties with specific identification that could help establish the legal framework for resolving their dispute. Mitchell's long service with Colonel Morrison would give him authority to negotiate on behalf of his commanding officer, but it would also make him reluctant to exceed his orders by accepting arrangements that contradicted his mission parameters. "Miss Morrison," Mitchell replied, his formal address deliberately ignoring Starr's claim to married status. "Your father has specific concerns about the circumstances that led to your current situation. He requires your immediate return for debriefing about how you came to be in Traitor Donnelly's possession rather than under proper military protection." The explanation revealed that Colonel Morrison viewed his daughter's situation as a security breach that required investigation rather than simply a family matter involving marriage choices. Starr's presence in Donnelly's wagon suggested either kidnapping or deliberate deception that could have implications for military operations throughout the territory. Daniel found himself considering whether Starr's original capture and sale might indeed constitute kidnapping that would justify her father's concern for her safety. If she had been taken against her will and sold to traders without her consent, then her current situation might represent continued exploitation rather than the voluntary marriage arrangement he had believed he was entering into. "Tell me the truth about how you ended up with Donnelly," Daniel said quietly, recognizing that his moral position depended on understanding the actual circumstances of Star's journey to his auction house. Star's hesitation before answering suggested that the complete truth was more complicated than her previous explanations had indicated. "I was traveling to visit relatives when our escort was attacked by hostile warriors seeking to prevent cooperation between tribal leaders and military authorities. During the fighting, I was captured by men who did not recognize my identity and who assumed I was simply another tribal woman who could be sold to traders." The explanation provided context for her presence in Donnelly's wagon while raising questions about why she had not revealed her true identity to secure proper treatment from her captors. Her decision to maintain her disguise, even when it meant accepting marriage to a stranger, suggested either extraordinary courage or desperate circumstances that had made deception seem preferable to truth. "Why didn't you tell your captors who you were?" Daniel asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal the complicated political position her family name carried in territorial conflicts. "Because revealing my identity would have made me a valuable hostage rather than simply an inconvenient prisoner," Star replied with the kind of practical wisdom that reflected extensive experience with frontier dangers. Men who traffic in human beings prefer simple transactions to political complications that might attract federal attention to their operations. The strategic thinking behind Star's deception impressed Daniel, while highlighting the dangers she had faced even before reaching his auction house. Her ability to assess threats and develop survival strategies under extreme pressure demonstrated intelligence and courage that commanded his respect regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Sergeant Mitchell's voice interrupted their private conversation with increased urgency. "Mr. Brennan, we have legal authorization to enter this building if Miss Morrison is not produced immediately. Your continued resistance will be recorded as obstruction of federal military operations, which carries serious criminal penalties under territorial law." The escalating threats forced Daniel to make immediate decisions about how far he was willing to go to protect Star's autonomy against her father's authority. Military law would indeed supersede civilian resistance if Colonel Morrison's men chose to use force, but Daniel's understanding of territorial justice suggested that such actions would require justification that might not withstand later legal scrutiny. Eleanor appeared at Daniel's shoulder with additional ammunition and a grim expression that reflected her assessment of their deteriorating tactical situation. "Mr. Brennan, there are more riders approaching from the east. Looks like Colonel Morrison decided to send reinforcements in case his first group encountered resistance." The arrival of additional military personnel transformed their standoff from a manageable confrontation into a potential siege that could not be sustained with their limited resources and defensive capabilities. Daniel found himself facing the reality that protecting Star might require more courage and tactical skill than civilian resistance could provide. Against organized military force, Star's hand touched his arm with gentle pressure that conveyed both gratitude and resignation. "Daniel, you have shown me more consideration and respect in 2 days than I received during years of military discipline disguised as paternal protection. But I cannot allow your kindness to result in consequences that could destroy your life and business." The selfless concern for his welfare touched Daniel more deeply than any romantic gesture could have, revealing character qualities that transcended the commercial nature of their original arrangement. Star's willingness to sacrifice her own preferences to protect others demonstrated the kind of moral courage that Daniel's father had allegedly possessed before military service had compromised his principles. "What if we could prove that our marriage is legal and that you're here voluntarily?" Daniel asked, still searching for alternatives to either submission or hopeless resistance against overwhelming odds. Star's expression showed both hope and skepticism about the possibility of legal solutions to their military problem. Sheriff Thompson would need to be very brave to challenge Colonel Morrison's authority, especially when my father's reputation for retribution against those who cross him is well known throughout the territory. The mention of Colonel Morrison's reputation for retaliation provided sobering context for the risks involved in resisting his demands. Local officials who valued their careers and their safety would naturally be reluctant to antagonize a military officer whose influence extended far beyond simple family authority into territorial politics and federal military policy. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as additional riders reached the auction house, their arrival marked by the kind of disciplined coordination that indicated military training rather than civilian law enforcement. Daniel counted at least 8 distinct voices as the new arrivals coordinated with Sergeant Mitchell's original group to establish positions around the building. 12 men, Eleanor observed with the tactical awareness that her Irish heritage had taught her to develop during years of conflict with superior authority. Too many to fight, but maybe enough to suggest that they consider this a serious military operation rather than simple family business. The large number of soldiers assigned to retrieve a single woman indeed suggested that Colonel Morrison viewed his daughter's situation as more than a domestic dispute requiring paternal authority. The military resources committed to her recovery indicated either exceptional concern for her safety or significant worry about the political implications of her current circumstances. Star moved to the window where she could observe her father's men as they established their tactical positions around the auction house. "They're setting up for a siege rather than immediate assault," she reported. "My father always preferred to exhaust opponents' resources before resorting to direct confrontation." The strategic assessment provided Daniel with both hope and concern about their immediate prospects. A siege would give them time to summon local authorities who might support their legal position, but it would also allow Colonel Morrison to bring additional resources to bear while isolating them from community support that might otherwise complicate military operations. The standoff had reached a critical juncture, where decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether their resistance could transition from desperate defiance to legitimate legal challenge of military authority. Daniel found himself facing choices that would test not only his courage but his understanding of the principles worth risking everything to defend. The tension reached a breaking point when the sound of a single horse approaching through the storm cut through the military positioning around the auction house. Through the swirling snow emerged Sheriff Benjamin Thompson, his badge glinting against his heavy winter coat as he rode directly into the center of what had become a military standoff. In the heart of Cedar Junction, Thompson dismounted with the deliberate confidence of a man who had faced down armed groups before, his weathered face showing no intimidation at finding himself surrounded by federal soldiers. His reputation for fair dealing and personal courage had earned him respect throughout the territory, making him one of the few local officials who might challenge military authority when civilian rights were at stake. "Sergeant Mitchell," Thompson called out, his voice carrying clearly across the wind-swept space between the mounted soldiers and the auction house. "I received reports of armed men threatening civilians in my jurisdiction. I trust you have proper authorization for whatever operation you're conducting here." The sheriff's formal approach immediately transformed the confrontation from a family dispute into an official law enforcement matter requiring documentation and legal justification. Mitchell found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining military operations to civilian authority, a situation that required careful balance between following orders and respecting local jurisdiction. "Sheriff Thompson," Mitchell replied with professional courtesy that barely concealed his frustration at civilian interference. "We have federal authorization to retrieve Colonel Morrison's daughter, who has been unlawfully detained by individuals who misrepresented the nature of their relationship with her." Thompson's response revealed his sophisticated understanding of the legal complexities involved in conflicts between military and civilian authority. "Sergeant," I'll need to see that federal authorization, along with evidence that the young woman is being held against her will. Under territorial law, married women have specific rights that supersede paternal authority, even when military families are involved. The demand for documentation created exactly the kind of bureaucratic obstacle that military operations were designed to avoid through superior firepower and commanding authority. Mitchell's obvious discomfort suggested that his orders from Colonel Morrison had emphasized speed and discretion rather than legal formalities that might complicate or delay the mission. Inside the auction house, Daniel felt a surge of hope at Sheriff Thompson's arrival and his obvious willingness to challenge military authority on behalf of civilian rights. The sheriff's reputation for integrity and courage was well-deserved. But Daniel understood that even Thompson's influence had limits when facing federal military power backed by Colonel Morrison's political connections. Starr watched the exchange between military and civilian authorities with the kind of strategic assessment that her education and family background had taught her to apply to complex political situations. "Sheriff Thompson is taking considerable personal risk by challenging my father's authority," she observed. "Colonel Morrison does not forget those who interfere with his operations, and his influence extends far beyond simple military command." Eleanor moved between the windows to monitor the positions of the various armed groups now surrounding the auction house, her tactical awareness evident in her assessment of how the arrival of civilian law enforcement might affect the military's willingness to use force. "Having the sheriff here changes things," she noted. "Military men think twice about actions that might require explanations to federal investigators later." The psychological impact of official civilian oversight was indeed evident in the more cautious posture adopted by Morrison's soldiers. What had begun as a straightforward retrieval operation was becoming a complex legal matter that could generate unwanted attention from territorial authorities who might question both the methods and the justification for military intervention in domestic affairs. Sheriff Thompson approached the auction house door with measured steps, his hands visible and non-threatening despite the rifle holstered on his saddle. "Mr. Brennan," he called, "I need to speak with you and your wife about the circumstances of your marriage and her current situation. These gentlemen claim she's being held against her will." The formal request provided Daniel with an opportunity to present his version of events to legitimate authority while demonstrating that Starr was indeed free to speak for herself about her preferences regarding her future. However, the situation also created pressure to convince Thompson that their relationship was genuine rather than simply a commercial arrangement that had evolved beyond its original parameters. Daniel opened the door carefully, keeping his rifle visible but not immediately threatening. "Sheriff Thompson, my wife and I are grateful for your intervention. Starr is here voluntarily, and our marriage is legal under territorial statutes. These soldiers are attempting to kidnap her based on family authority that doesn't supersede her rights as a married woman." Starr stepped forward to stand beside Daniel, her presence providing visual confirmation that she was not being physically restrained or coerced into remaining against her will. Her bearing displayed the kind of dignified composure that commanded respect while challenging assumptions about Native American women's autonomy and decision-making capabilities. "Sheriff Thompson," Starr said clearly, her educated English and confident demeanor immediately establishing her credibility as someone capable of making informed decisions about her own life. "I am indeed Colonel Morrison's daughter, but I am also Daniel Brennan's wife under Nebraska territorial law. I choose to remain here with my husband rather than return to a military authority that has never recognized my right to make independent decisions about my future." Thompson's experienced eyes assessed both Starr's demeanor and the dynamics between the couple, looking for signs of coercion or deception that might indicate the military's claims had merit. His years of law enforcement had taught him to read body language and verbal cues that revealed the truth behind competing claims about domestic situations. "Ma'am," Thompson said respectfully. "Your father's representatives claim that your marriage was arranged through fraudulent means, and that you lack legal authority to enter into such contracts without paternal consent. Can you provide evidence that contradicts these assertions?" The sheriff's request for evidence created an opportunity for Starr to demonstrate both her legal sophistication and her commitment to remaining with Daniel despite family pressure to return to military control. Her response would need to address both the validity of their marriage and her legal standing as an adult woman capable of making binding decisions. Starr's answer revealed the careful preparation she had given to anticipating exactly such questions. "Sheriff, my education at Carlisle Indian Industrial School was specifically designed to prepare Native Americans for independent participation in white society, including the legal authority to make binding contracts and marriage arrangements. The federal government invested 4 years in teaching me to function as an autonomous individual, and I am exercising that autonomy by choosing to honor the marriage contract I entered into with Daniel Brennan." The sophisticated legal argument impressed Thompson while creating uncomfortable contradictions for the military representatives who were simultaneously claiming that Starr lacked legal authority while representing a government that had invested heavily in her education for exactly the kind of independence she was now asserting. Sergeant Mitchell's obvious frustration with the direction of the conversation led him to interrupt with more direct assertions of military authority. "Sheriff, Miss Morrison was kidnapped and sold to traders before being fraudulently represented to Mr. Brennan as an independent woman seeking marriage. The entire arrangement was based on deception and criminal activity that makes any resulting contract invalid under both territorial and federal law. The accusation forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality that Starr's presence in Donnelly's wagon had indeed resulted from criminal activity, even if her current marriage to Daniel represented a genuine choice rather than continued exploitation. The legal implications of contracts based on criminal activity created complications that could not be easily resolved through simple assertions about personal autonomy." Thompson's response demonstrated his understanding that the legal issues involved required more sophisticated analysis than could be provided during an armed standoff in a blizzard. This situation involves complex questions of federal versus territorial jurisdiction, women's legal rights, and the validity of contracts resulting from criminal activity. These matters require proper legal proceedings rather than field decisions made under pressure. The sheriff's assessment provided both sides with face-saving alternatives to immediate confrontation, while establishing a framework for resolving their dispute through legal channels rather than military force. However, the proposed solution would require Colonel Morrison's representatives to accept delays and civilian oversight that their orders might not allow. Starr recognized the opportunity that Thompson's intervention had created for establishing legal precedents that could protect other women in similar situations. "Sheriff Thompson, I formally request protection under territorial marriage laws, while proper legal proceedings determine the validity of my union with Daniel Brennan. As a Carlisle graduate and an adult woman, I assert my right to legal representation and due process rather than summary return to military authority." The formal legal language demonstrated Starr's sophisticated understanding of the procedural protections available under territorial law, while creating obligations for local authorities to provide the due process she had requested. Thompson found himself in the position of either supporting her rights or implicitly endorsing military authority over civilian legal protections. Daniel stepped forward to support Starr's legal position with his own formal statement. "Sheriff Thompson, I also request protection under territorial law for my legal marriage to Starr Brennan. Our union was performed in good faith under Nebraska statutes, and any attempt to dissolve it without proper legal proceedings would violate both our rights as citizens of this territory." The coordinated legal strategy demonstrated that both Starr and Daniel understood the importance of forcing their situation into official legal channels where civilian rights received protection rather than allowing military authority to operate outside normal procedural safeguards. Their sophisticated approach impressed Thompson while creating political pressure for him to support territorial jurisdiction against federal military claims. The sheriff's decision would indeed require considerable personal courage, as challenging Colonel Morrison's authority could result in political retaliation that might end Thompson's career and possibly threaten his personal safety. However, his reputation had been built on exactly such willingness to support legal principles against powerful interests when justice required such stands. "Sergeant Mitchell," Thompson said with quiet authority, "I'm placing this matter under territorial jurisdiction, pending proper legal review of the issues involved. Miss Morrison will remain under civilian protection while courts determine the validity of her marriage and her legal standing regarding family authority versus personal autonomy." The sheriff's decision created immediate tension among Morrison's soldiers, who found themselves faced with local law enforcement that was willing to challenge their federal authority. Mitchell's position was particularly difficult, as his orders from Colonel Morrison had certainly not anticipated civilian officials who would assert territorial jurisdiction over military family matters. "Sheriff Thompson," Mitchell replied with barely controlled anger, "you are interfering with authorized federal operations. Colonel Morrison will not accept civilian obstruction of his lawful authority over his own daughter, regardless of any territorial claims about marriage validity." The explicit threat revealed the true nature of the conflict between federal military power and territorial civilian authority, forcing Thompson to choose between backing down from his legal position or accepting the consequences of defying one of the most powerful military officers in the Nebraska Territory. Thompson's response reflected years of experience with powerful men who attempted to use intimidation when legal authority proved insufficient for their purposes. "Sergeant, Colonel Morrison's authority over military personnel does not extend to overruling territorial marriage laws or denying due process to civilian residents. If the colonel has concerns about his daughter's situation, he can pursue them through proper legal channels like any other citizen." The standoff between military and civilian authority had reached a point where compromise seemed impossible, and someone would need to back down or risk escalating the conflict beyond anyone's ability to control. The blizzard continued to rage around them, creating an atmosphere of enforced isolation that intensified every decision and made retreat increasingly difficult for any party. Inside the auction house, Daniel found himself amazed by the courage displayed by both Starr and Sheriff Thompson in challenging Colonel Morrison's authority. Their willingness to risk everything for principles of justice and individual rights inspired him to consider what sacrifices he might be willing to make for causes larger than his personal comfort and security. Starr's hand found his in the tense silence that followed Thompson's declaration, her touch conveying both gratitude for his protection and partnership in facing whatever consequences their resistance might bring. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the commercial arrangement that had brought them together, becoming a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to defending each other's autonomy. Eleanor's practical voice cut through the charged atmosphere with observations that reminded everyone of the physical realities they were facing. "Sheriff, this storm's getting worse, and we've got a dozen armed men who need shelter before someone freezes to death out there. Whatever legal proceedings you're planning, they'll have to wait until weather permits travel to proper facilities." The environmental factors indeed created pressure for immediate, practical solutions that could preserve everyone's safety while allowing time for legal resolution of the complex jurisdictional questions involved. The blizzard had transformed their confrontation from an immediate crisis into a forced coexistence that would test everyone's patience and flexibility. Doc Thompson recognized the wisdom in Eleanor's assessment and the opportunity it provided for reducing immediate tensions while establishing frameworks for eventual legal resolution. Sergeant Mitchell, I suggest we establish a temporary truce while this storm passes. Your men can shelter in the hotel, and will convene proper legal proceedings once weather permits travel to the county seat. The proposed compromise offered both sides alternatives to immediate confrontation while maintaining their essential positions about authority and jurisdiction. However, the success of such arrangements would depend on Colonel Morrison's willingness to accept delays and legal processes that he had clearly hoped to avoid through direct military action. Mitchell's consultation with his men revealed the strain that extended exposure to blizzard conditions was placing on soldiers who had not anticipated prolonged operations in such weather. The practical necessities of survival were beginning to outweigh the military imperatives that had brought them to Cedar Junction, creating opportunities for face-saving compromises that served everyone's immediate needs. Sheriff Thompson, Mitchell said finally, I will accept temporary arrangements for my men's shelter while I contact Colonel Morrison for guidance about how to proceed under these circumstances. However, I cannot guarantee that the Colonel will accept civilian jurisdiction over what he considers to be military family business. The conditional acceptance provided breathing space for all parties, while acknowledging that the fundamental conflict between military and civilian authority remained unresolved. The next phase of their confrontation would depend on Colonel Morrison's response to civilian resistance and his willingness to pursue legal remedies rather than military solutions. As the various armed groups began making arrangements for shelter during the continuing storm, Daniel realized that his simple desire for companionship had indeed evolved into something far more significant than personal comfort. He had become a participant in conflicts over individual rights, civilian authority, and the limits of military power that could influence territorial development for generations to come. Star's presence beside him, as they watched the temporary dispersal of their adversaries, reminded him that their partnership had become something worth defending, regardless of how it had originally been arranged. The woman who had arrived as a purchased commodity had become a genuine partner whose courage and intelligence commanded his respect, and perhaps something deeper that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The storm that raged outside seemed less threatening than the human conflicts that had converged on his auction house, but Daniel found himself hoping that both natural and political weather would eventually clear to reveal possibilities for justice and partnership that had seemed impossible just days before. The test of their relationship and their principles was far from over, but they had survived the first crucial challenges by standing together, rather than allowing external pressures to divide them. The hotel's main dining room had been hastily converted into an impromptu courthouse, with tables arranged to accommodate the most unusual legal proceedings Cedar Junction had ever witnessed. 3 days after the blizzard had forced a temporary truce, the storm had finally cleared enough to allow the arrival of Territorial Judge Harrison Caldwell, whose reputation for scholarly jurisprudence and personal integrity made him the ideal arbiter for the complex constitutional questions at stake. Judge Caldwell was a man in his 60s whose distinguished silver beard and scholarly demeanor reflected decades of legal scholarship and frontier justice. His appointment to the territorial bench had been based on his expertise in constitutional law and his ability to navigate the competing jurisdictions that often clashed in Nebraska's developing legal system. The case before him represented exactly the kind of precedent-setting dispute that could influence territorial law for generations. Colonel James Morrison had arrived the previous evening with an additional escort of 20 soldiers, transforming Cedar Junction into an occupied military zone that tested every principle of civilian authority that Sheriff Thompson had attempted to assert. Morrison's presence filled the makeshift courtroom with the kind of commanding authority that had shaped frontier military policy throughout the Indian Wars, his weathered face bearing the rigid determination of a man unaccustomed to having his Decisions questioned by civilians. The colonel's physical appearance immediately explained much about Starr's sophisticated bearing and obvious intelligence. Morrison possessed the same keen eyes and dignified posture that characterized his daughter, though his features had been hardened by decades of military command and political maneuvering that had shaped territorial development through force rather than negotiation. Daniel found himself studying the man whose orders had resulted in his father's death, searching for signs of the brutality and moral compromise that had defined Patrick Brennan's final military service. What he saw instead was a professional soldier whose commitment to duty had apparently superseded personal considerations throughout a career dedicated to advancing federal authority in hostile territory. Starr sat beside Daniel at the defendant's table, her composed demeanor reflecting the kind of political sophistication that her Carlisle education had been designed to produce. She had chosen to wear the blue dress Eleanor had provided rather than traditional clothing, creating a visual statement about her successful integration into white society while maintaining the dignity that her royal heritage demanded. Judge Caldwell opened the proceedings with the formal language that established the legal framework for addressing unprecedented questions about federal military authority versus territorial civilian jurisdiction. This court has been convened to determine the validity of the marriage between Daniel Brennan and the woman known as Starr Brennan, along with related questions about individual autonomy versus family authority in cases involving federal military personnel. The opening statement immediately established that the proceedings would address constitutional principles rather than simple family disputes, creating opportunities for legal precedents that could influence similar cases throughout the frontier territories. Judge Caldwell's scholarly approach promised thorough examination of complex issues rather than expedient solutions that might satisfy immediate political pressures. Colonel Morrison's legal representative was Captain William Hayes, a military lawyer whose expertise in federal jurisdiction and Indian affairs made him formidable opposition for any civilian attorney attempting to challenge military authority. Hayes possessed the kind of precise legal mind that had served the military well in previous disputes over territorial jurisdiction and tribal rights. Your Honor, Captain Hayes began his opening argument. This case involves the kidnapping and fraudulent sale of a federal dependent to civilians who were deliberately deceived about her identity and legal status. Miss Morrison lacks authority to enter into binding contracts without paternal consent, making any resulting marriage invalid under both territorial and federal law. The military's legal strategy immediately challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Daniel and Starr's defense by asserting that their marriage had been invalid from the beginning due to misrepresentation and lack of proper authority. Hayes's approach would require comprehensive refutation of each legal claim while establishing alternative frameworks for protecting individual autonomy against family authority. Starr's legal representation came from an unexpected source. Attorney Margaret Sullivan had traveled from Omaha specifically to argue the case, bringing with her a reputation for defending women's rights and challenging male authority that made her both respected and controversial throughout the territory. Sullivan's presence transformed the proceedings from a simple dispute about marriage validity into a broader examination of women's legal standing in frontier society. Margaret Sullivan was a woman in her 40s whose professional competence and personal courage had earned her recognition as one of the territory's most effective advocates for individual rights against institutional authority. Her decision to represent Starr demonstrated the significance she attached to establishing legal precedents that could protect other women from similar conflicts between personal autonomy and family control. Your Honor, Sullivan addressed the court with the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention despite prevailing prejudices against female attorneys. This case represents a fundamental test of whether American legal principles regarding individual liberty apply equally to women and minorities, or whether military and family authority can supersede Constitutional protections when those protections become inconvenient for established power structures. The framing of constitutional issues immediately elevated the proceedings beyond simple territorial law into questions about federal constitutional principles that had national implications. Sullivan's strategy would require the court to address whether individual rights could be limited by racial, gender, or family considerations without violating fundamental American legal principles. Judge Caldwell's scholarly interest was evident in his careful attention to both legal arguments and their broader implications for territorial jurisprudence. Counselor Sullivan, please present evidence regarding your client's legal capacity to enter into marriage contracts and her current wishes regarding the validity of her union with Mr. Brennan. The request for evidence provided Sullivan with opportunities to demonstrate Starr's sophisticated education and her clear understanding of the legal implications of her marriage, while also establishing that her current situation represented personal choice rather than continued exploitation by men who viewed her as property rather than an autonomous individual. Starr's testimony began with a detailed account of her educational background and the specific preparation she had received for independent participation in American society. Your Honor, I spent 4 years at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where the federal government invested substantial resources in teaching me English, American law, Christian religion, and domestic skills specifically designed to prepare me for successful integration into white civilization. The testimony immediately challenged Captain Hayes's assertion that Starr lacked legal authority by demonstrating that the federal government had specifically educated her for exactly the kind of independence she was now asserting. Her Carlisle credentials created uncomfortable contradictions for military arguments that simultaneously claimed federal authority while denying the effectiveness of federal educational programs. The stated purpose of my education, Starr continued, was to prepare me to function as a bridge between tribal and white communities, using my knowledge of both cultures to facilitate peaceful cooperation rather than military conflict. My marriage to Daniel Brennan represents exactly the kind of cultural integration that federal educational policy was designed to promote. The strategic argument positioned Starr's marriage as fulfillment of federal policy goals rather than defiance of military authority, creating political pressure for the court to support educational initiatives that the government had promoted as alternatives to military solutions for cultural conflicts. Judge Caldwell's questions revealed his understanding of the broader policy implications involved in the case. Miss Brennan, do you consider your marriage to represent voluntary compliance with federal integration policies or resistance to military authority exercised by your father? The question forced Starr to address the fundamental tension between supporting federal policy goals while challenging specific manifestations of federal military authority that contradicted those same policies. Her answer would need to demonstrate sophisticated understanding of constitutional principles while avoiding direct confrontation with legitimate federal authority. Your Honor, Starr replied with careful precision, my marriage represents compliance with federal educational policy that specifically prepared me to make independent decisions about cultural integration. My resistance is not to legitimate federal authority, but to the misuse of military power to override civilian legal protections that the federal government has established to protect individual rights. The nuanced legal argument impressed Judge Caldwell while creating difficulties for Captain Hayes, who found himself in the position of arguing that federal military authority should override federal educational policy and federal constitutional protections. The internal contradictions in the military's position weakened their legal standing while strengthening Starr's claims about individual autonomy. Daniel's testimony focused on the evolution of his relationship with Starr from commercial arrangement to genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Your Honor, one originally arranged to purchase a bride because my personal circumstances made conventional courtship difficult. However, my relationship with Star has developed into something far more meaningful than a business transaction. The honest admission about the commercial origins of their relationship created vulnerability that Captain Hayes immediately attempted to exploit. Mr. Brennan, you admit that you purchased Miss Morrison from a trader who was engaged in human trafficking. How can any relationship based on such criminal activity be considered legally valid? The question struck at the heart of the moral and legal complications that had shaped their situation from the beginning. Daniel's answer would need to acknowledge the problematic origins of their relationship while demonstrating that their current union represented genuine choice rather than continued exploitation. Captain Hayes, Daniel replied with quiet dignity, I acknowledge that my original transaction with Donnelly was morally questionable, regardless of my intentions. However, Star and I have chosen to transform that flawed beginning into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to each other's welfare and autonomy. Judge Caldwell's intervention revealed his understanding that the case involved questions about redemption and transformation that went beyond simple legal technicalities. Mr. Brennan, do you believe that relationships based on problematic origins can evolve into legitimate partnerships if both parties freely choose to continue them? The philosophical question provided Daniel with opportunities to address broader themes about second chances and personal growth that resonated with frontier values about redemption and self-improvement. His answer would influence the court's assessment of whether their relationship deserved legal protection despite its unconventional beginning. Your Honor, Daniel said with conviction, I believe that people can choose to create something good from circumstances that began badly. Star and I have chosen to build a partnership based on honesty, respect, and mutual support. The origins of our relationship do not define its current nature or its future potential. The testimony demonstrated Daniel's moral growth from viewing Star as a purchased commodity to recognizing her as an equal partner whose autonomy deserved protection. His transformation provided evidence that their relationship had indeed evolved beyond its commercial origins into something worthy of legal recognition and protection. Eleanor Walsh's testimony provided a crucial third-party perspective on the dynamics between Daniel and Star during their brief time together. Your Honor, I've been managing Mr. Brennan's household for years, and I can testify that his treatment of Star has been respectful and considerate from the moment she arrived. She is clearly free to make her own choices about remaining or leaving. The testimony from a neutral observer who had witnessed their daily interactions provided credible evidence that Star was not being coerced or manipulated into remaining against her will. Eleanor's reputation for honesty and practical wisdom made her testimony particularly valuable for establishing the voluntary nature of Star's current situation. Sheriff Thompson's testimony addressed the broader implications of the case for territorial law enforcement and civilian authority. Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental test of whether territorial civilian authority can protect individual rights against federal military overreach. If Colonel Morrison can override our marriage laws and due process protections, then territorial government becomes meaningless. The political argument highlighted the constitutional stakes involved in the case, transforming a family dispute into a broader examination of federalism and the balance between military and civilian authority in territorial governance. Thompson's testimony provided legal justification for the court to assert territorial jurisdiction against federal military claims. Captain Hayes's cross-examination of Star focused on her motivations for maintaining her disguise rather than revealing her true identity to secure proper treatment from her captors. Miss Morrison, why did you choose to accept marriage to a stranger rather than simply revealing your father's identity to ensure your safe return to military protection? The question was designed to suggest that Star's current situation represented continued deception rather than genuine choice, implying that her marriage to Daniel was simply an extension of the survival strategy she had employed while in captivity. rather than authentic commitment to their relationship. Starr's response revealed the sophisticated, political thinking that had guided her decisions throughout her ordeal. Captain Hayes, revealing my identity would have transformed me from an inconvenient prisoner into a valuable hostage. Traders who traffic in human beings prefer simple transactions to political complications that might attract federal investigation of their operations. The explanation provided logical justification for Starr's decision to maintain her disguise, while highlighting the criminal nature of the enterprises that had exploited her. Her strategic thinking demonstrated intelligence and courage that commanded respect while refuting suggestions that her marriage represented continued victimization rather than autonomous choice. Colonel Morrison's personal testimony provided dramatic confrontation between father and daughter over questions of family authority versus individual autonomy. The colonel's commanding presence filled the makeshift courtroom as he addressed the court with the kind of military precision that had shaped territorial policy throughout his career. "Your Honor," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent commanding men in combat situations. "My daughter has been missing for weeks under circumstances that suggest kidnapping and exploitation by criminals who prey on displaced tribal members. Her current situation represents continued victimization that requires immediate correction through proper military authority." The father's obvious concern for his daughter's welfare created sympathy for his position while highlighting the genuine love that had motivated his military response to her disappearance. However, his authoritarian approach to family relationships created tension with Starr's assertions about personal autonomy and individual rights. Judge Caldwell's question to Colonel Morrison addressed the fundamental conflict between family authority and individual rights that lay at the heart of their dispute. "Colonel Morrison, at what point does parental concern become parental control that violates an adult child's right to make independent decisions about her own life?" The question forced Morrison to confront uncomfortable implications of his approach to family authority while acknowledging that Starr's education and obvious competence suggested capacity for independent decision-making that traditional paternal control might not be able to override legitimately. "Your Honor," Morrison replied with visible struggle between personal affection and military authority, "my daughter's education was designed to prepare her for useful service to her people and her country. However, that education was not intended to encourage defiance of legitimate family authority or disregard for the safety concerns that her current situation creates." The response revealed Morrison's fundamental inability to reconcile his daughter's independence with his own need to maintain control over family matters that he viewed as extensions of his military responsibilities. His position highlighted broader cultural conflicts about women's rights and family authority that frontier society was struggling to resolve. Starr's direct response to her father's testimony provided the case's most dramatic moment as the daughter confronted father over questions that had shaped their relationship throughout her adult life. "Father," she said with quiet dignity that commanded attention throughout the courtroom, "you sent me to Carlisle to learn independence and self-determination. I am exercising exactly those qualities by choosing to remain with a man who treats me as an equal partner rather than returning to authority that has never recognized my right to make decisions about my own future." The confrontation between father and daughter crystallized every tension that had driven their family conflict while highlighting broader questions about whether educational policies designed to promote independence could be limited by family authority when independence became inconvenient for established power structures. Judge Caldwell's deliberation stretched through the long winter afternoon as the makeshift courtroom remained silent, every person present understanding that the decision would establish precedents affecting countless lives throughout the frontier territories. The judge's scholarly approach to constitutional law had been evident throughout the proceedings, but the complexity of balancing federal military authority against territorial civilian jurisdiction required careful consideration of implications that extended far beyond the immediate case. The tension in the hotel dining room was palpable as Daniel and Starr sat together, their hands intertwined in a gesture that had evolved from nervous comfort to genuine partnership during the hours of testimony that had laid bare their relationship before public scrutiny. The commercial arrangement that had brought them together had been transformed through shared adversity into something that neither had anticipated when Marcus Donnelly's wagon first arrived in Cedar Junction. Colonel Morrison occupied a chair near the military contingent, his weathered features betraying none of the internal conflict that his testimony had revealed between paternal affection and institutional authority. The rigid military bearing that had defined his career was beginning to show cracks as he confronted the possibility that his daughter's independence might indeed represent successful fulfillment of federal educational policies he had supported, rather than defiance of legitimate family authority. Attorney Margaret Sullivan reviewed her notes with the satisfaction of someone who had presented constitutional arguments that could influence territorial law for generations. Her decision to represent Starr had been motivated by recognition that the case offered unprecedented opportunities to establish legal protections for women's autonomy against both family and institutional authority that historically had subordinated individual rights to masculine control. Captain Hayes maintained the professional composure expected of military legal counsel, though his private assessment suggested that the internal contradictions in federal policy regarding Native American education and family authority had created legal vulnerabilities that civilian courts might exploit to limit military jurisdiction over matters traditionally considered internal military business. Sheriff Thompson's presence represented more than local law enforcement. His willingness to challenge federal military authority had demonstrated that territorial civilian institutions possessed both the legal framework and the political courage necessary to protect individual rights against institutional overreach when justice required such protection. His career might indeed suffer from confronting Colonel Morrison's influence, but his principles had been vindicated by Judge Caldwell's willingness to assert territorial jurisdiction. Eleanor Walsh sat quietly in the back of the makeshift courtroom, her practical wisdom having contributed significantly to creating the domestic stability that had allowed Daniel and Starr's relationship to develop beyond its problematic origins. Her testimony about their daily interactions had provided crucial evidence that Starr's autonomy was being respected rather than compromised by her marriage to Daniel. When Judge Caldwell finally emerged from his private deliberations, his expression carried the weight of decisions that would echo through legal precedent and social policy throughout the developing frontier. The judge's reputation for scholarly jurisprudence had been earned through exactly such careful consideration of constitutional principles under circumstances that tested the flexibility and wisdom of American legal institutions. This case, Judge Caldwell began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, presents fundamental questions about the nature of individual liberty, family authority, and federal jurisdiction that strike at the heart of American constitutional principles. The court's decision must balance competing legitimate interests while establishing precedents that serve justice rather than mere convenience. The opening statement immediately established that the judge understood the broader implications of his ruling for territorial development and constitutional law. His scholarly approach promised comprehensive analysis of the legal principles at stake, rather than expedient solutions that might satisfy immediate political pressures while creating problematic precedents for future cases. The evidence presented demonstrates that Miss Starr Morrison received extensive education at federal expense, specifically designed to prepare her for independent participation in American society. The judge continued, "The federal government's investment in her education for autonomy creates legal presumptions about her capacity for self-determination that cannot be casually dismissed when such autonomy becomes inconvenient for family or military authority." The legal reasoning immediately addressed Captain Hayes's arguments about Starr's legal capacity while establishing federal educational policy as evidence supporting her claims to independence. Judge Caldwell's analysis created a constitutional framework for protecting the autonomy that federal programs had been designed to develop. Furthermore, the judge added, the testimony reveals that Miss Morrison's marriage to Mr. Brennan has evolved from its admittedly problematic commercial origins into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared adversity, and common commitment to each other's welfare and autonomy. The court finds credible evidence that both parties freely choose to continue their relationship, despite external pressures to dissolve it. The assessment of their relationship's evolution provided legal recognition for the transformation that had occurred during their brief time together. Judge Caldwell's acknowledgment of their genuine partnership validated their claims that commercial origins had not prevented the development of authentic mutual commitment. Starr felt tears of relief and validation gathering in her eyes as the judge's words confirmed her belief that American legal institutions could indeed protect individual rights against family and military authority when such protection was necessary for justice. Her struggle for autonomy was being vindicated through constitutional principles rather than mere personal preference. Daniel's grip on Starr's hand tightened as he realized that Judge Caldwell's reasoning was leading toward legal recognition of their marriage despite its unconventional origins. The lonely auctioneer who had purchased a bride to ease his isolation was being transformed into a legitimate husband whose relationship deserved legal protection and social recognition. However, Judge Caldwell continued, his tone becoming more serious. The court cannot ignore the criminal circumstances that led to Miss Morrison's presence in Trader Donnelly's wagon or the systematic exploitation of displaced tribal members that such trafficking represents. While the current relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Brennan appears to be genuine and voluntary, the broader issues of human trafficking require immediate attention from federal law enforcement. The transition to criminal justice issues demonstrated the judge's understanding that protecting individual cases of successful relationships could not excuse systematic criminal enterprises that exploited vulnerable people. His ruling would need to address both immediate justice for Starr and Daniel, while establishing a framework for preventing similar exploitation of others. Therefore, the judge announced, this court rules that the marriage between Daniel Brennan and Starr Morrison Brennan is legally valid under Nebraska territorial law. Mrs. Brennan possesses full legal capacity as an educated adult woman to make binding decisions about her marital status, and her choice to remain with her husband is protected by constitutional guarantees of individual liberty and due process. The formal recognition of their marriage created an immediate stir throughout the courtroom as military representatives realized that federal authority had been successfully challenged by territorial civilian jurisdiction. Colonel Morrison's expression showed the strain of accepting that his daughter's independence had been legally validated despite his personal opposition to her choices. Starr's tears flowed freely as the weight of months of uncertainty and conflict was finally lifted by official recognition of her right to choose her own path. The validation meant more than simple legal protection. It represented acknowledgement that her education, intelligence, and character qualified her for the independence she had struggled to achieve against family and institutional resistance. Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude not only for the legal protection of his marriage, but for the personal transformation that his relationship with Starr had created. The scarred man who had felt marked by his father's controversial legacy had discovered that love and partnership could indeed provide redemption from the shadows of inherited guilt and social isolation. Additionally, Judge Caldwell continued, this court hereby orders federal authorities to conduct comprehensive investigation into the human trafficking operations that brought Mrs. Brennan into Trader Donnelly's possession. The systematic exploitation of displaced tribal members represents federal crimes that require prosecution regardless of any successful individual outcomes that may have resulted from such criminal enterprises. The order for federal investigation demonstrated the judge's commitment to addressing systemic problems rather than simply resolving individual cases. His ruling would create legal pressure for federal authorities to confront the criminal networks that had operated with relative impunity throughout the frontier territories. Colonel Morrison rose slowly from his chair, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the legal defeat of his attempt to assert family authority over his daughter's autonomous choices. The man who had commanded thousands of soldiers in frontier conflicts found himself unable to command the obedience of one educated woman who had chosen to exercise the independence his own policies had helped to create. "Your Honor," Morrison said with visible effort to maintain professional composure, "I respect this court's jurisdiction and its ruling regarding my daughter's legal status. However, I hope that Mrs. Brennan will consider maintaining family relationships despite the legal independence she has achieved through these proceedings." The attempt at reconciliation revealed the genuine paternal affection that had motivated Morrison's authoritarian response to his daughter's disappearance. His public acknowledgement of her legal independence represented significant personal growth for a man whose career had been built on unquestioned authority and institutional control. Starr stood gracefully and approached her father with the dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout their family conflict. "Father," she said quietly, "I have never sought to abandon our family relationship, only to establish that such relationships must be based on mutual respect rather than unquestioned authority. My marriage to Daniel does not end my connection to you, but it does establish that I am now an independent woman with divided loyalties and shared responsibilities." The diplomatic response offered Colonel Morrison opportunities for ongoing family relationship while maintaining the independence that the court had legally recognized. Starr's maturity in balancing family affection with personal autonomy demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that her education had been designed to develop. Morrison's embrace of his daughter was brief but genuine, conveying both his acceptance of her independence and his relief at her safety after weeks of uncertainty about her fate. The reunion between father and daughter provided emotional resolution to family conflicts that had been exacerbated by broader cultural tensions about women's rights and military authority. Margaret Sullivan approached Starr with professional satisfaction that having established legal precedents that could protect other women facing similar conflicts between family authority and personal autonomy. "Mrs. Brennan," she said warmly, "your courage in challenging both family and military authority has created legal protections that will benefit countless women throughout the frontier territories. Your case will be studied and cited for years to come." The recognition of broader significance provided Starr with understanding that her personal struggle had contributed to social progress that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. Her willingness to risk everything for independence had indeed created a legal framework for protecting other women's rights against institutional authority that historically had denied such autonomy. Sheriff Thompson's congratulations to both Daniel and Starr reflected his satisfaction at having successfully asserted territorial civilian jurisdiction against federal military authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," he said with obvious pride, "you've helped establish that civilian legal protections mean something even when powerful interests prefer to ignore them. That's a victory for everyone who believes in constitutional government." The broader political implications provided Daniel and Starr with understanding that their relationship had become a symbol of civilian rights against institutional overreach. Their personal happiness had been achieved through struggles that strengthened democratic institutions and individual protections throughout the territory. As the various parties prepared to depart Cedar Junction, Daniel found himself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in his life during the past week. The lonely auctioneer who had purchased a bride to ease his isolation had discovered genuine partnership with a woman whose intelligence, courage, and integrity had inspired him to become a better man than he had ever imagined possible. Stars. Thoughts were equally focused on the unexpected journey that had brought her from desperate captivity to legal independence and genuine marriage with a man who had learned to value her autonomy as much as her companionship. The woman who had hidden her identity to survive had found someone who loved her for exactly the qualities that family authority had sought to control. Eleanor. Walsh's practical preparations for the couple's return to normal domestic life reflected her satisfaction at having witnessed the development of a genuine partnership from the most unpromising commercial beginning. Her maternal instincts had recognized the potential for authentic love beneath the surface of their arranged marriage, and her guidance had helped nurture that potential into reality. The auction house that had once represented Daniel's refuge from social complications had become the site where constitutional principles were tested, and where two lonely people had discovered that mutual respect could indeed provide the foundation for lasting partnership. The building's transformation from commercial space to domestic home paralleled the evolution of its occupants from strangers to partners. Marcus. Donnelly's arrest by federal marshals provided justice for the criminal enterprise that had exploited Starr and countless other vulnerable people throughout the frontier territories. The traitor's prosecution would send clear messages that human trafficking would no longer be tolerated as an acceptable business practice, regardless of frontier conditions or cultural prejudices that had historically protected such exploitation. Legal precedents established by Judge Caldwell's ruling would indeed influence territorial law for generations, creating protections for individual autonomy against family and institutional authority that had never before been tested in frontier courts. Starr's case would be studied by legal scholars and cited by attorneys defending women's rights throughout the developing Western territories. Colonel Morrison's departure from Cedar Junction marked the beginning of a different relationship with his daughter, one based on mutual respect rather than military authority. His acceptance of her independence represented personal growth that paralleled the broader social changes occurring throughout frontier society as democratic institutions matured and individual rights gained protection against institutional overreach. 6 months later, the Brennan Auction House had become a thriving center of commerce that served multiple communities throughout the Nebraska Territory. Daniel's reputation for honest dealing had been enhanced by his principled stand for individual rights, attracting customers who respected his integrity and his commitment to equal treatment, regardless of cultural background. Starr had established herself as a cultural bridge between tribal and white communities, using her education and family connections to facilitate peaceful cooperation rather than military conflict. Her work had demonstrated the success of federal educational policies while providing practical alternatives to the authoritarian approaches that had characterized previous territorial administration. Their marriage celebration, held on the anniversary of Judge Caldwell's ruling, drew guests from throughout the territory representing every community that had been affected by their legal victory. The ceremony combined Christian and traditional Native American elements, creating a cultural synthesis that honored both backgrounds while establishing new traditions for their shared future. The children who eventually blessed their union grew up bilingual and bicultural, embodying the kind of successful integration that federal educational policies had been designed to achieve. Their success demonstrated that cultural differences could indeed be bridged through mutual respect and shared commitment to justice rather than the military force and cultural suppression that had previously characterized frontier development. Daniel's scars, which had once marked him as damaged goods unsuitable for conventional marriage, became symbols of survival and strength that commanded respect throughout the territory. His transformation from lonely bachelor to respected community leader demonstrated that personal redemption was possible when supported by genuine partnership and shared commitment to principles larger than individual comfort. Star's journey from hidden captive to territorial leader illustrated the potential for individual courage to catalyze social transformation when supported by democratic institutions and constitutional protections. Her success validated federal educational investments, while demonstrating that independence and cultural integration could be achieved through choice rather than coercion. The auction house continued to serve as neutral ground where different communities could meet safely for commercial and social interaction. Daniel and Star's home had become a symbol of successful cultural cooperation that provided practical alternatives to the military solutions that had previously dominated frontier policy. Their love story had indeed become something far greater than personal romance, demonstrating that individual courage and mutual respect could triumph over institutional authority and cultural prejudice when supported by democratic principles and constitutional protections. The mail-order bride who had once hidden her identity had become a territorial leader whose influence extended throughout the frontier regions. Together they had proven that the most powerful force for social change was not violence or institutional authority, but love that transcended every boundary that prejudice and fear had constructed. Their partnership continued to serve as evidence that understanding and justice could provide better solutions than the conflict and domination that had historically characterized territorial development. The lonely auctioneer and the hidden princess had found in each other not only personal happiness, but also the courage to challenge systems of oppression that denied basic human dignity to anyone deemed inconvenient by established power structures. Their victory had been achieved through principles rather than force, creating lasting change that would benefit generations of frontier families seeking justice and genuine partnership in an often hostile world. The establishment of the Brennan Cultural Institute, 3 years after their marriage, represented the culmination of their shared vision for bridging cultural divides through education rather than military force. The institute occupied a substantial brick building constructed with funds donated by territorial officials who recognized the value of Star's approach to peaceful cultural integration, creating the first institution of its kind in the Nebraska Territory. Students from both white and Native American communities attended classes together, learning languages, customs, and practical skills that prepared them for successful interaction across cultural boundaries. The curriculum reflected Star's sophisticated understanding of both educational systems, combining traditional tribal knowledge with European academic subjects in ways that honored both heritages while preparing students for the complex realities of frontier life. Daniel's role as administrator allowed him to apply his business skills to institutional management while supporting Star's educational vision with practical expertise in finance and organization. His transformation from lonely auctioneer to educational leader demonstrated that personal growth could indeed create opportunities for service that extended far beyond individual satisfaction or commercial success. The Institute's success attracted attention from federal education officials who had struggled to develop effective approaches to cultural integration throughout the Western Territories. Delegations of government administrators and military officers visited Cedar Junction to observe the peaceful cooperation that Star's methods had achieved, creating models that could be replicated in other frontier communities facing similar cultural tensions. Eleanor Walsh had assumed responsibility for training domestic instructors who could teach practical household skills, while respecting cultural differences that shaped family structures and gender roles across different communities. Her Irish heritage provided a valuable perspective on maintaining cultural identity while adapting to new social environments, creating curricula that honored diversity rather than demanding complete assimilation. The Institute's library became a repository for tribal histories and cultural documents that might otherwise have been lost during the rapid social changes affecting Native American communities. Star's scholarly approach to preserving traditional knowledge while facilitating cultural adaptation, created resources that served both educational and historical purposes for future generations. 10 years after Judge Caldwell's landmark ruling, the legal precedents established by their case had been cited in dozens of similar disputes throughout the frontier territories. Women facing conflicts between family authority and personal autonomy found legal protection through arguments that referenced Starr's successful assertion of educational credentials and individual rights against institutional pressure. The Brennan children had grown into remarkable young adults whose bilingual abilities and cultural sophistication made them natural ambassadors between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Their success demonstrated that cultural integration could indeed produce individuals who enhanced both heritages rather than diminishing either through compromise or assimilation. James Daniel Brennan, their eldest son, had inherited his father's business acumen along with his mother's linguistic abilities, establishing trade relationships that connected tribal communities with white commercial networks in ways that benefited both economies. His work demonstrated that cultural cooperation could create practical advantages that military domination had never achieved. Mary Starr Brennan had followed her mother's path toward education and cultural mediation, becoming the first Native American woman admitted to the University of Nebraska's teacher training program. Her academic success validated federal educational investments while proving that individual achievement could transcend racial and gender barriers when supported by adequate preparation and institutional courage. Their youngest child, Samuel Morrison Brennan, named in honor of his grandfather's eventual acceptance of cultural integration, had shown remarkable talent for legal studies that promised to continue the family tradition of challenging institutional authority through constitutional principles rather than violent resistance. Colonel Morrison's own transformation had been gradual but genuine, as his recognition of his daughter's success forced him to reconsider assumptions about military solutions to cultural conflicts that had shaped his entire career. His endorsement of the Cultural Institute had provided crucial political protection against conservative critics who viewed cultural integration as a dangerous compromise with enemy populations. The colonel's memoirs, published 5 years after his retirement, included extensive discussion of his daughter's influence on his understanding of effective frontier policy. His acknowledgement that educational approaches had achieved better results than military force represented significant personal growth for a man whose reputation had been built on exactly the opposite philosophy. Sheriff Thompson's political career had flourished as a result of his principled stand against federal military overreach, leading to his election as territorial representative and eventual appointment as federal district judge. His success demonstrated that defending constitutional principles could indeed create political advantage when voters recognized the importance of civilian authority over military power. The auction house continued to serve as the economic heart of Cedar Junction's growing prosperity, but its significance had expanded far beyond simple commercial function. The building had become a symbol of successful cultural cooperation that attracted visitors from throughout the nation who wanted to observe practical alternatives to the conflict and domination that characterized frontier development in less enlightened communities. Daniel's business relationships now extended throughout the Western territories, connecting producers and consumers across cultural boundaries that had previously prevented economic cooperation. His reputation for honest dealing and cultural sensitivity had created commercial networks that served multiple communities, while demonstrating the practical advantages of peaceful integration over military conquest. Starr's correspondence with former classmates from Carlisle had created informal networks of educated Native Americans who shared information about successful strategies for maintaining cultural identity while participating in American economic and political institutions. These relationships provided crucial support for individuals facing similar challenges in communities less tolerant than Cedar Junction had become. The federal investigation ordered by Judge Caldwell had indeed resulted in the prosecution of numerous traders involved in human trafficking operations throughout the frontier territories. Marcus Donnelly's conviction and 10-year prison sentence had sent clear messages that such exploitation would no longer be tolerated as acceptable business practice. Regardless of the cultural background of the victims, the investigation had also revealed the extent to which military personnel had either participated in or ignored criminal activities that targeted displaced tribal members, leading to reforms in military policy and accountability measures that provided better protection for vulnerable populations during periods of territorial transition. Educational reformers from Eastern universities had begun citing the Brennan Cultural Institute as evidence that peaceful cultural integration was not only possible but practically superior to military approaches that created lasting resentment and continued conflict. Academic studies of their methods had influenced federal Indian policy throughout the Western Territories. The Institute's agricultural program had introduced farming techniques that combined traditional Native American knowledge with European agricultural science, creating sustainable farming practices that increased crop yields while preserving soil quality. These innovations had spread throughout the territory, demonstrating that cultural exchange could produce practical benefits for all participating communities. Starr's publication of bilingual textbooks that taught English and tribal languages simultaneously had created educational resources that were adopted throughout the frontier territories. Her scholarly approach to language instruction honored both linguistic traditions while providing practical tools for cross-cultural communication. The medical clinic associated with the Institute combined traditional tribal healing practices with European medical knowledge, creating healthcare approaches that served diverse populations more effectively than either system could achieve independently. The success of this integrated approach had attracted attention from medical schools seeking to understand alternative therapeutic traditions. As they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, Daniel and Starr reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed their desperate commercial arrangement into a partnership that had influenced territorial development throughout the American West. Their personal happiness had been achieved through struggles that strengthened democratic institutions and individual protections for countless other families. The evening celebration brought together hundreds of friends and colleagues representing every community that had been touched by their work toward cultural understanding and peaceful cooperation. The gathering demonstrated that individual courage and mutual respect could indeed create social transformation that served human dignity rather than institutional convenience. Their grandchildren, now beginning to attend the Cultural Institute, represented the third generation of successful cultural integration that validated every principle their grandparents had struggled to establish. These young people embodied the promise that America had always represented, that diverse backgrounds could strengthen rather than weaken democratic society when supported by education and mutual respect. The legacy of the lonely auctioneer and the hidden princess continued to inspire individuals facing similar challenges throughout the expanding nation. Their story provided evidence that love and justice could triumph over fear and prejudice. When supported by constitutional principles and personal courage to challenge institutional authority that denied basic human dignity. As they stood together on the porch of their thriving auction house, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska plains in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel and Starr Brennan embodied the promise that America had always represented, that individuals willing to stand for justice could indeed create better futures through courage, love, and unwavering commitment to the principles that made democratic society possible. Their story would be remembered not just as a romance between unlikely partners, but as a testament to the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional authority and create social progress that served human dignity rather than mere convenience. In a world often dominated by fear and prejudice, they had chosen love and justice, and their choice had transformed not only their own lives, but the entire community that had witnessed their extraordinary journey from commercial arrangement to genuine partnership and social leadership. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.